Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining this webinar hosted by the National Library of Scotland, talking about knowledge, power, and climate justice. I'm really excited to be hosting this webinar and hosting this what's going to be an absolutely wonderful and stimulating conversation, I'm sure, between our guest speakers today, Zarina Ahmad and Ali Watson. Just a few housekeeping things at the start. I'm just going to give a very brief introduction. I want to keep my introduction as brief as possible. Then I'll hand over. We'll hear from our two speakers individually first. Then we're going to go into a conversation about the themes of knowledge, power, and how that relates to the climate crisis. And hopefully at the end, if my timekeeping allows, we're going to have some time for some audience questions. Just to point on that, like as I'm sure most of you are used to by now, there is a Q&A function in Zoom. So if you do have a question, pop it in there. I'll try my best to get through those at the end. But we're also very keen to feel free to use that Q&A function as a comment box if you'd like to comment on any of the things which either myself or our speakers are talking about today, or if you'd like to give feedback or give your thoughts, do feel free to use that function as a comment box. And again, I'll try and keep an eye on that and read some of those out as we go along, so it'll be a bit more of an interactive experience. So do feel free to use that. So from that out of the way, I'll just get started and introduce today's talk. We're hearing about the climate crisis more and more. Every day it seems we turn on the television or look at the news and see another landscape on fire, another city flooded, and another storm raging. From being something only a handful of people talked about, the climate crisis has now been mainstreamed, getting more attention than ever. Yet the way the crisis is framed should give us pause. Whenever politicians or the media talk about climate change, it's a scientific or an ecological issue with social and economic implications. But the discourse around climate change rarely involves discussions of justice and of power. The narratives and the lived realities of the climate crisis are inextricably linked to power, structures both current and historic, and so it's difficult to comprehend the full scale of the crisis and its implications when discussions surrounding it are as narrow as they are. Crucially, those voices who are suffering the worst effects of the crisis, mainly from the global south, are almost never heard, be it in the media or in international policy discussions. Sites of knowledge in society, like public libraries, can influence people, and I'm excited to talk about these themes of knowledge and power with our two speakers this afternoon. Zarina Ahmad is a climate change communicator and trainer who focuses on climate justice, ecofeminism, and sustainable food practices. Zarina's work focuses on increasing the participation of ethnic minority groups in environmentalism and climate change discussions, as well as highlighting the reluctance to embed cultural knowledge and experience in the heritage sector. Zarina worked as the Climate Change and Environment Officer for the Council for Ethnic Minority Voluntary Organisation for several years. During her time there, she organised a conference where ethnic minority organisations and Scottish Government representatives met to discuss the lack of inclusivity in climate change dialogues in Scotland and the lack of funding for environmental projects by ethnic minority groups. As a result of her work, between 2013 and 2020, over 100 minority ethnic organisations have applied successfully to the Scottish Climate Challenge Fund, forgive me. And in 2020, she was featured on BBC4's Women's Hour's Power List. Ali Watson is a Professor of International Relations at the University of St Andrews and Managing Director of the Third Generation Project, an international think tank based in Scotland that uses education and research to enable social change for climate justice. Through educational initiatives, workshops, dialogue and research, the Third Generation Project prioritises the marginalised communities most affected by the climate crisis. Established in 2016, the organisation educates diverse audiences, including Western policymakers, academics and students, providing advocacy tools that prioritise the voices and local knowledges of marginalised frontline communities, essential components of a response to climate change that has justice at its heart. In 2019, Ali was awarded an OBE for services to education. So now I'm just going to pass it on to our speakers, but again, to remind you, if you just joined, there is a Q&A function to ask questions, but you can also use it as a comment box if you'd just like to add your thoughts throughout the discussion. But now if I throw over to Zarina, is that okay?
Yeah, hi Henry, it's lovely to be here and thank you for inviting us. So yeah, it's an interesting, very interesting topic, and because I think my work, when I was working with like Scottish Government and Keep Scotland Beautiful on the Climate Challenge Fund, one of the things that came out was that the job I was going to be doing, which was to engage ethnic minorities on climate change, it was going to be a hard sell, because according to people in power, that ethnic minorities were interested in climate change. And now that in itself was like a red rag to a bull for me. And it led to me then engaging with ethnic minorities communities right across Scotland. But what I found was that it was one of the easiest jobs that I ever had. And the reason why it was one of the easiest jobs I had was because there was this embedded knowledge about climate change, right? So it goes back to, well, where does knowledge come from? And where do we hold knowledge? And where do we get knowledge from? Because I find that really fascinating, because traditionally in the West, knowledge is also always from an institute. We are told things. We think we live in a democratic world, in a democratic society, where we have the freedom to ask questions. But I suppose many times we get shut down. And it's that shutting down, please, then that gives people power, right? And again, for me, I think working with ethnic minorities, and I don't want to put them into one box, which is really important. And so I'm going to struggle by using the term ethnic minorities, and we're just going to use diverse communities from around the world. There was so much learning there. And the learning was that that climate change was real. It was affecting people. It was affecting people's lives. It was affecting their livelihoods. Whereas the conversations in the UK and Scotland were very much predominantly around carbon emissions, and also that it was happening somewhere else, and it was somebody else's problem and somebody else's issue. Even though, you know, we're partly responsible. You know, we can kind of shake that responsibility off us if we want to. But yeah, there was always this kind of perception around climate change. And that made me start thinking about climate change in terms of like looking at, well, what does climate justice mean? What is injustice, really, climate change? And yes, there's a lot of, when we talk about climate justice, we talk about the global south, and we talk about the injustice of the global south in terms of like the ones that are most impacted, the ones that have the least resources, the ones that have the least resilience, the ones that have the least power to do any changes. However, within the UK, we have links with the diaspora communities. So these diverse communities that have links across the world, that have this embedded knowledge, that have real stories, that have that link to other parts of the world, and understand the emergency that the climate crisis has. Yet those communities were the ones that were being left out. Those communities ones were not being engaged with. Those communities' knowledge was just not being acknowledged. And it's not just at the beginning of the work that I did, which is like 10 years ago, but even now, there's like over 150 projects that have been engaging on climate change from the ethnic minority sector. However, all that information and that knowledge from those communities in Scotland actually hasn't gone anywhere. It's not being used in anything. It's not being used in any research. It's not being used by any academics. It's not being used by any think tanks. And it's very frustrating, because that leads to like power. So who holds the power, and why is it then those that are in power then also hold knowledge, right? And those are the questions that I suppose I have for the audience, is like, how do we break that? And how do we move away from understanding where knowledge comes from, and giving the place of knowledge the hierarchy systems that we create? Yeah, and for me, I think cultural knowledge is something that education should definitely include. So that's probably a good place to bring Ali in.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, there's already so many questions I want to follow up on that, but I'll pass over to Professor Ali Watson now. Thank you.
You're on mute.
You're on mute, Ali, sir.
Sorry, I always say to people, after like 18 months, you would think I wouldn't mute myself. Anyway, no, that's a really good place to start off, and and thank you as well to everybody for allowing this and facilitating this conversation. So, I mean, I guess then this question about knowledge and about power and where those, where those sort of things come from. And I suppose, thinking about it from the point of view of what the Third Generation Project does, I mean, really, when we started off in 2016, it was really about thinking about doing academia differently in some way, because this recognition that for a lot of academics, doing this, amazing research, you might, go to a conference, there might be 10 people listen to your paper, you might publish, a paper, and it might be, like 10 people read it or something. But, much more than that, actually the voices then that get prioritized within discussions are often, voices that are, voices of power and privilege. And really, we, just thinking about how we wanted to sort of try and do academia differently. It was about thinking about whether there was actually a way of really, of prioritizing voices that are marginalized in knowledge processes, of seeing if there are ways to unlearn what the sort of different the different processes and hierarchies that that are present within universities and have always been present within universities, and actually just thinking about how to do that in sort of quite practical terms. I think as well, because I think it's really important as well for universities not just to be maybe informing policy discussions, or I mean they really should be this really broad engagement, and an engagement that actually has justice at its heart as well. So for us it was about thinking about that, but then very quickly thinking about climate justice within that, because I mean, Zarina and Henry have mentioned this sort of question of narrative and the narratives around climate change, and so often those narratives, and I think it's changing now, but say 10 years ago, if you had said to somebody, well, think about a sort of visual image of climate change, there wouldn't usually have been people in that image. There might have been ice, or there might have been polar bears, but that image of actually the impact that that climate change is already having and has been having for ages, just hasn't been part of that sort of bigger narrative. And I think that's really important. I mean, for us having a climate justice lens, and we can come on to sort of talk about definitions as well of climate justice, but having a climate justice lens, and then centering the impact particularly of communities that are already dealing with climate justice is actually a way that it is more likely then to lead to climate action. So if you have climate change education, that's very important, but you actually, and I'm not saying that the science is unimportant, the science is very important, but actually you have to as well have alongside that those narratives of climate justice, because I firmly believe that that's actually what leads to climate action, and it's what leads to as well to a recognition that climate justice is not just something in and of itself as a sort of distinct category. It's very much related to injustices in terms of race and gender and poverty, and all sorts of different injustices that are very much interconnected, and really come from those, historic processes of colonialism, which have, informed where universities have been at, as well, and processes of industrialization, and it's always very interesting for me. I'm going to say this and then just sort of stop there. It's always interesting, when you watch a documentary about climate change, and there's this discussion about the Industrial Revolution, and when the sort of when the emissions changed, etc. Carbon emissions changed, but it doesn't at that point then relate that industrialization to actually the colonization or colonialism that drove that industrialization. And that's why when we think about climate justice, we have to think that it is linked to those processes as well.
Right. So that's an interesting point you've just brought in, right? Sorry, Henry, I'm just going to, because I want to, because I think when we think about colonialism, right, we think about it in terms of like a political structure, a war, and, even like in the worst case scenario, taking over a country, taking over resources, exploitation. However, what we don't discuss is post-colonialism and the legacy of colonialism. And I'm probably a product of that, right? And so I'm going to explain what that can look like, which others may not get. If you're white, you won't get this, right? But so my parents were from India, were born in India. So I even struggle to say they're from India because it's difficult, right? But yeah, they were born in India. They migrated across to Pakistan during the war. Now, the independence war was caused by colonialism in India, right? Now, my ancestors were farmers, right? So they had land, and the way they farmed was not in terms of like commercial farming, and food was not a commodity. Food was very much, you farmed to eat, to feed yourself, but also to feed your village, right? And that was what my ancestors did, right? Now, because of colonialism, right, that was thought as being uncivilized, unprogressive, and we need to move forward from that. So my father and my grandfather, right, so my grandfather moved away from the farm when they got displaced, moved into the city in Pakistan, and set up a business. My father came to the UK when he was young and had lots of aspirations and got educated and all of this, right? But what it meant for me as a child when I was younger, right, was that we lived in Newcastle, and we had, right, so Newcastle has quite a fair, diverse community, right? And especially the area where we lived in was quite diverse. And in the street, right, there were gardens, right? There was like small front gardens. Now, in these small front gardens, most people grew lovely roses, right? Nice rose bushes. Now, however, the ethnic minorities who had this culture of growing food in their gardens or growing food back home, wherever it was, on their farms, on their land, whatever. But food for them was you grow food and you eat the food that you grow, right? So my parents did this. My grandfather did this in the UK, right? However, my generation, right, was totally embarrassed by it. We used to walk up and down the street and go, oh my God, look at those messy gardens. Look how ridiculous that looks, how embarrassing that is. And we grew up with aspirations of having these lovely gardens with white roses and red roses and orange roses and very pruned gardens. And that is what we wanted. Now working with communities and seeing to the communities that I work with, that all of these that have got post-colonial legacy embedded in them. I don't know how to describe it, but yeah. So they have this after effect, is that then it's like, well, we were embarrassed by this. And now we're being told that we need to grow our own food again. But all these years we were embarrassed by growing food, and it was embarrassing for us. And it wasn't just us, ourselves, that looked upon these gardens, but it was also our white peers and our friends and neighbors, everybody. It was like an embarrassment when your garden was shabby and it was overgrown, but it was full of beautiful fruit and veg. Now I can see it was full of, full of abundance of fruit and veg. But to us as a child, it looked disgusting. So this is like the things of post-colonial legacy that nobody talks about yet. And I still think this is really important because we don't recognize it. We just talk about colonialism and we talk about capitalism, when we talk about racism. But what is really important now is this post-colonial legacy, especially when we're having conversations around climate justice.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I just wanted to kind of say that, because it's something that I think is really hard to see and hard to understand unless you're in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I just think it's really sort of valuable to hear. I mean, I was struck the other day, I was watching something on TV, and there was all this sort of discussion about, you know, sustainable, you know, agriculture, and how, you know, there is such a thing as sustainable agriculture now, and you can have sustainable agriculture, you know, as if this was just like some, you know, brand new sort of thing, without this sort of reference as well to, you know, why as well are we talking about sustainable agriculture? Because, you know, sometimes then what has happened, you know, is that, you know, agricultural lands have been used and denuded in all different types of ways. And, you know, and now that, you know, there needs to be this sort of different agricultural practice, and, you know, and it was, you know, it was sort of presented as sort of new knowledge. And I think that's the, you know, the thing that's always so interesting as well, because that's what those knowledge hierarchies do as well, is that, you know, like for this sort of new knowledge, rather than sort of thinking about existing knowledge and where is existing knowledge, it's like, oh, well, hang on, there's, you know, there's this as well, I think. So what do you think, Zarina, like in terms of, you know, even the climate justice narratives that are ongoing at the moment, you know, that place then for that post-colonial narrative, how does that change those narratives?
Yeah, I suppose it changes because it recognises communities within the UK as well of being affected by climate justice. So most of the narratives around climate justice is in the global south, right? Or it'll be areas of poverty, right? So the climate justice narrative is still not actually including people from diverse communities in the UK that are impacted by post-colonial legacy, but also by things like the intersectionality of gender injustice, you know, race injustice, and also then poverty as well. Because you find, like, I mean, look at COVID. COVID's just really highlighted the inequalities that the societies that we live in. And whereas the BME community were the ones that were being most impacted. And it's not because they were genetically more disposed to it. It was because of the living conditions that we have in the UK, that a lot of people are in poverty or live in like poor housing conditions, don't have access to green space, all of these issues. So again, with the climate crisis within the UK, when we talk about climate justice, we're not actually acknowledging the people that are most impacted. And again, it goes back to that power and knowledge, whose voices are being heard, whose voices are around that table, and who holds the power.
And who actually is defining what climate justice is in the first place. You know, I mean, you know, I think it shouldn't be, you know, it shouldn't be institutions and knowledge bases that, you know, that are sort of rooted in that injustice and having sort of created that injustice as, you know, as well. I don't think, you know.
I want to go back to that point of institutions maybe in a bit, but maybe before that, I was struck by something you said, Ali, when you were describing your work. You said it was a process of unlearning, that a lot of it is really redressing knowledge practices where people are situated in. Everyone is, and it's a process of an ongoing process of relearning things and challenging assumptions and questioning positionality and whatnot. And I wonder for both of you what the reaction to that has been, because as I imagine there's been a lot of are people receptive to that idea? Is there backlash to that idea? These are power structures are comfortable for certain people, right? Power structures can mean formal power structures, institutions, but they can mean the role that you play in society and your status in society and whatnot. And I think people can feel very challenged by that. How is that? I wonder if you could elaborate, both of you, on this process of unlearning.
You want to go first?
I don't mind. And well, you know, and actually, I mean, I should say, you know, like when you think about it as well, you know, like, you know, you have to recognize privilege, you know, and you have to recognize that, you know, that I'm sitting here, you know, like as a, you know, like professor or whatever at St Andrews, and actually then sort of saying, well, you know, it's about unlearning, about, you know, so I mean, I think you've got to recognize as well, you know, I've got to recognize the privilege, you know, of my position, and, you know, being able to sort of, you know, I mean, certainly, you know, you can say to some students, well, you know, you really have to, you know, do things maybe in this way or think in this way, and, you know, and I have had comments and said, well, you know, it's all right for you because, you know, you're at this, you know, like you're X amount of years down your career path, and, you know, so of course you can sort of say, well, you know, this is how you should be doing something. I think it's probably uncomfortable. There are uncomfortable conversations, I think, to be you know, to be had, because I think, you know, when we think about, I mean, you know, I mean, universities, there's a lot of discussion in universities about you know, decolonizing the curriculum, and I always put quote marks around that, because I always think, you know, as a white professor at an elite institution, it is not for me to define what decolonizing the curriculum means, you know. But I think actually, I mean, thinking about those sort of changes in hierarchies, it's about lots of different things. It's not just about, for example, in universities, looking at reading lists and thinking, you know, can we change those reading lists? It is partly about that, but, you know, it's also about saying, well, you know, what are the hierarchies within universities that allow certain power dynamics even to exist within universities, you know, so that maybe you know, that professors are in more privileged positions, or, you know, narratives can be claimed by those who are, you know, who are sort of higher up, you know, are hierarchically in a sort of different place. And I think that's really, it's really important, you know, to just constantly recognize. And I think as well, though, I mean, it has to be said, it's, you know, that universities as well, and, you know, are set up in certain ways in terms of those sort of knowledge structures, you know, so that in order to, you know, like advance in a particular academic career, there are certain things that you have to do that are not actually in line with, you know, what actually it would take to really sort of change some of these structures and narratives. So, you know, I think, you know, for anybody, I mean, it's, you know, it's a constant, I hate to say that word, journey, but it is a bit of a journey, and a sort of constant sort of thinking, okay, so, you know, where is the best place to be, and how actually to decenter yourself within particular conversations, I guess.
Yeah, so that's quite interesting, talking about like institutions. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about where other places of knowledge lie as well. Yeah. So for instance, like within, like I said, cultural knowledge, community knowledge, like a lot of think tanks that get involved in like policy and decision making, right? Mm-hmm. Which is really important, because that's where the power lies, within these, like, you know, policy structures. And they tend to go to communities that are well resourced, that have the capacity. Rather than thinking, right, okay, this is just the elite communities, because they are elite, right? Because they are the white privileged ones as well, because they're the ones that have the resources, they have the capacity, they already have existing knowledge, that recognized existing knowledge, I should say, right? So for me, it's like turning that around a little bit, and resourcing those that have that embedded cultural knowledge is really important. And if we can start get more voices around tables is really important, and giving space to have that understanding that not everything's not black and white. It doesn't have to be seen through a Western eyes to understand it. Like even like something like time, right? Somebody was talking about time the other day. I was on another talk, and and somebody kept saying, oh yeah, but we're short for time. We don't have enough time. So we're pushed to do things with time. And I'm like thinking, yeah, but time is a human constraint. It's something that we've constructed, time. So, and different cultures around the world have a different relationship with time. So, it's like, so when you're working with different communities and different culture, you can't impose your own cultural time on them. So it's, again, and I know it's very difficult because we do live in like a certain frame of time, but it's just recognized like that even the way we look at time is a colonialized form of living. So I think it's like really understanding and giving respect to different viewpoints and acknowledging them that these viewpoints could actually, are on that spectrum, because I don't want to say right or wrong, because I don't believe that there is right or wrong. And there's space to be wrong and learn from that wrong, rather than just everything being yes and no, being linear, which is very much a colonial thinking, because it's very much about structure and about, it's very, to be, what's the word I'm looking for, uniform, right? It's all about uniformity, structure, regulating, and control, right? Is by having this yes and no paradigm. Whereas if we think more like more on a spectrum, where we think that, okay, like Ali was saying, it's like there's a journey, and we're all in a journey, and time is part of that journey. So it's to really acknowledge that there are different forms of knowledge from different places. And again, it goes back to history as another form of knowledge. And what we learn in history, it was something that my dad taught me when I was very young, and it always stuck by me, that history is always written by the winners. The losers never have their words. So you'll never know what really happened in history, because that was wiped out, right? And for me, that always stuck by me, because I really struggled in my history classes knowing that I'm only sitting here listening to one side of history. So this is where I think places like libraries, museums, all of these other places should really make an effort to try to get an understanding of both sides of history. And I think, again, that learning is so important, because that gets reflected in everyday knowledge, gets reflected in media. And so if we can have a more balanced history, would be much better. And I think it's easier now because we have social media. So both sides of whatever's happening, modern history is coming out. But yeah, it's not suppressing history is really important. And I think Yvette, with the Yvette that we had at one of our events, and she said something as well. She said, nothing but the whole history needs to be told.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm glad you brought it onto that point of institutions like universities and like libraries, like the National Library of Scotland, which is of course a formal site of knowledge. People look to the National, it has authority, it's in the title. People may assume an authority there just by the nature of its title, and people may be intimidated by that, I think. So I wonder, to both of you, of course, what you were just saying there, Serena, about acknowledging those other types of knowledge, embedding cultural knowledge into these formal structures of power. How is the best way to go about that in a justice oriented way? Is it about incorporating it into these structures of power? Is it about breaking down these power structures to begin with? I wonder how when we are sat in National Library of Scotland, in the University of St Andrews, what is the way to what are the things we can do?
Well, first of all, I suppose it's having diversity around the table, right? So it's making sure that who's around the decision making table, so around that power table, that power is shared, right? Then it's resourcing, putting the resourcing and the time to build relationships with those voices that aren't being heard, right? Whatever marginalized voices, and it does take time, and it does take resources. It's not the low hanging fruits. So it isn't the first group that you go to. It's like you have to dig deep, and you have to go out and do the outreach work. And then I think it is being honest about the history that we tell. and acknowledging that the history is one-sided. And even that acknowledgement to say that this history or this story that we're telling you is from this perspective. I think even that would go a long way, right? So that people can then, even for themselves, think, right, okay, so this is only one side of the story, so I need to find out more. Or it opens up people's thinking to understand that there is possibly more than one side to a story. And again, it would then, the think tanks, the media, and I'm going to use the media because we get a lot of people get their knowledge from media, it wouldn't be so biased. So I do think, but it's taking the time and just making sure that everything is fairly represented. And if it's not, because you can't always be fairly represented, but to acknowledge that it isn't fairly represented, it is only one side of the story.
And I think sort of, you know, as well, it's, I mean, just completely to chime with that is sort of recognizing as well that the way that knowledge is presented, you know, is sometimes, you know, there's a hierarchy in terms of, you know, whether knowledge is accepted as valid or not, you know, does, you know, somebody who, you know, sort of, you know, writes sort of academic papers on climate change, the perspective that they might give on climate change, you know, that's their academic perspective. But, you know, what about then the perspective of communities? And we sort of, we make those sort of hierarchies of knowledge, and we sort of say, well, you know, knowledge has to be almost sometimes presented in a particular way for it to be valid, or that there's some knowledge that is more valid than other knowledges, and to just to recognize that isn't the case. You know, and as Zarina said, that, you know, it needs all voices there, and knowledge in different formats, that's, you know, coming over in different formats, I think, as well.
I'll just read a comment out from it was a few minutes ago that I didn't get a chance to read it, but Peter from Yorkshire, he comments, decolonization of the curriculum might not be what is read, but how this can be interpreted through a post-colonial lens, so that the ideological biases within a text are not taken for granted, but exposed, challenged, and problematized. So I suppose, like, part of that is thinking, and again, to apply it perhaps to libraries and to the climate crisis, perhaps we can provide resources, for example, to books and reading lists and whatnot, but that's not enough if you're not actually engaging with people to, I don't want to say the phrase, but teach them how to read or how to read a text. But a lot of these things, there are ideological assumptions in a lot of these texts which aren't immediately clear. And not just text in our narrative, in conversation, there can be quite difficult. So it is a process, I suppose, of not just providing resources, but actually making sure we speak about them and problematize them, and actually have these conversations, like you're saying, Serena, have these people around the table, so that we can actually pick and expose what's being presented to us potentially as objective knowledge or rational knowledge, perhaps.
Well, I'm smiling to myself because you said something which is really key to some of the work that I've been doing, which is to speak, right? But what you really mean is like to speak English, right? Or to read. So you said to read English, right? So that's what you really meant, was to read English, right? So again, it's like, well, yes, we're here in the UK, but this is not just an issue that we have in the UK, but this is a very Western issue that other languages are not recognized. And I've been working with a group of women just recently that have got connections to other parts of the world, but are in Glasgow, some of them are asylum seekers and refugees, and I'm showcasing them at COP26. But what I've said to them is that use your first language, use your mother tongue, because we've got to start standing up and saying that, you know, this is a valued language. You know, and this is their home language, and it's what they're comfortable in, it's what they're confident in, they're literate in it, they're educated in it. So it's not, you know, so it's like, so nobody can look down on. So I've said, like, so it's not your problem if somebody doesn't understand you, it's their problem because they don't know your language. And it's my problem because it's up to me to get an interpreter in to make sure that your voice is heard. So again, it's like, it's thinking differently, it's thinking and recognizing that just because someone doesn't speak English, they might speak another 6 languages. I mean, I work with people that do speak 6 languages, and English is their 6th language. And I just sit there in absolutely awe of them. and thinking, wow, you know, I can't even speak another language, and yet here they are speaking 6 fluent languages. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually I was smiling as well, Henry, because I think as well, I mean, one thing I always say to students in class, I mean, there's quite a lot, you know, like in feminist literature, you know, there's often, you know, that the author will say, you know, well, I came to my feminism through X, Y, and Z, you know, like maybe, you know, I grew up in a particular household that, you know, of a particular, you know, a very patriarchal household, or, you know, what, I mean, whatever it is. But, you know, I always say as well, you know, the you know, in my own discipline of international relations, you know, the sort of the books that are seen as the sort of, you know, you know, the sort of the real sort of, you know, those that have set the discipline, you know, it's not ever like anybody who's written those books says, well, you know, actually, you know, like, you know, I was brought up in a very, you know, like, you know, very this type of household, and I just, you know, very much believe in the sort of domination of, you know, this and that. You know, you don't say that, so that the it's like that very you know, the idea of the sort of liberal, or the sort of neoliberal, that, you know, there's a sort of amorphous individual, and it's almost like that person is valueless. So what they're saying is, well, you know, that's sort of setting the tone for everything. But, you know, that person isn't valueless, you know, that they have a set of values that they have put into the way in which they interpret the world, and that therefore has created a particular hierarchy, you know, as a result. And I always find it, you know, interesting, you know, within, you know, university research, how, you know, if you're doing research on, you know, sort of social movements, you're maybe, you know, sort of working with say with activist groups or something, that in some senses is seen as political research. But, you know, if you're doing, you know, like maybe security, and you're working with government, somehow that isn't seen as political research, you know. So there's a real sort of difference in the sort of the values upon particular, I think, types of knowledge, as Zarina says, but the ways in which those dominating knowledges have been able to do what they have done for so long, I think.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought COP26, Serena. I was hoping to bring that up just towards the end, but another thing you mentioned there was about this issue of language, and I'm really quite interested in this, both language in terms of framing, but also language itself is a really interesting thing. And when we're thinking about the climate crisis, we talk about, again, and it comes back to framing, we have the same images of climate crisis we see on the narrative. We have the same media narratives, the same images, the same stories of the things that get lost. So we know, and this is obviously all terrible, and it's right that we should know this, but we know that the rainforest is getting destroyed. We know cities are getting flooded. What doesn't get talked about is, because of those things, languages are getting lost. Languages are language loss is being accelerated more than ever, and there are other factors as well, of course, not just the climate crisis. But I think that's a really interesting one. The case for not only are if you don't speak English, you are far less likely to be listened to, but almost to add insult to injury, if I can say that, a lot of languages are just going to get lost in the next 100 years because of the impacts of the climate crisis. And that doesn't seem to be part of the narrative, the fact that it's not just cities and flooding and trees. Language, and attached to that a sense of self, a sense of identity, a sense of where you come from. Those are the other things that are getting lost from this crisis.
Yeah, and it's interesting how you say it's happening now, because it's always happened, but we've not related it to the climate crisis. It's happened because of colonialism, right? So colonialism was the start of all of that, taking away languages, taking away culture. Yes, and now and again, and we see it happening. We can visibly see it happen now because of the climate crisis, and it's heartbreaking. That's the only way I can describe it, because it must be heartbreaking for people when they know that they have to, like, especially for those that are displaced by the impacts of climate change. It must be heartbreaking to know that your culture is going to be lost, your heritage is going to be lost, your language is going to be lost. and it affects you. And I'm speaking from a personal point of view, because it affects your identity and belonging. Your sense of belonging, your sense of being rooted somewhere is really important. And having that sense of identity and belonging also makes you a stronger citizen, if you see what I mean. So it's easier in a way to be a citizen, and if you have a sense of belonging. And then, like, I'm not trying to trivialize this example, but I'm trying to use an example like litter picking, right, off the streets, right? If you don't feel a sense of belonging to the place you live in, because you don't have that sense of belonging, right, because you've migrated and you've been displaced or whatever, it's not going to be a priority in your head, right? Because, you know, you don't feel that this is your place. You don't have pride in that place. You don't feel that sense of belonging. And I'm just using that as an example, just a very trivial example. But it is that deep-rooted feeling of belonging. And I work with lots of communities, and one of the things I do with the communities is actually take them to the Highlands and take them to like Loch Lomond and take them to all of these places, because I want them to get that sense of belonging, that they actually belong to Scotland. Scotland belongs to them. Because when I talk to people from different parts of the world, one of the first things that they talk about is their homeland, their connection to their homeland. So when we're talking about climate change and climate justice, and we talk about the planet, people have a true connection to the actual land, their physical land. And that is so important. So when people are displaced, we actually take that away from them as well. We take that connection that people have to the natural environment. And that's what I think is so challenging about the climate crisis. And when we talk about the climate crisis, because we talk about it either in terms of science, and we talk about it in terms of like global impacts, carbon emissions, fossil fuels, or we talk about climate justice in terms of the impacts of humanity. But what we don't do is connect the two with like the planet as well. I mean, we talk about planet with them, you know, when we talk about climate change, but we don't connect it in terms of like a living entity and part of an ecosystem that we all belong to. And I think, and you find a lot of Indigenous cultures have that. And that's what's getting taken away, and that's getting removed. And that's dangerous.
Yeah. I'm conscious of time, and I want to I see there's some questions on the, I knew the time would just fly by, as it always does. There's and Neil, you've asked a question about policy, and I'll try and incorporate that because I want to bring up COP26, but I'm just going to jump up to another question that's come by someone who's not left their name, but it's a very interesting question, I think. They write, hey Zarina, I thought it was a really good point about Victor's knowledge. I guess we're also in an era of misinformation, which has questioned the institutionalization of knowledge and power. Gets a question to you both. Misinformation is being used as a way to brand and delegitimize people will possibly disagree with. How do we contend with this when we're bringing in under-acknowledged knowledge systems? And is this a moment where institutions are losing their hold on controlling knowledge? There's a lot to unpack there, but I think it's interesting.
Well, I want to start off on a positive thing, right? So I would want to say positive. And I would say there's lots of good people out there, right? So this is how I actually got involved with Ali, because Ali is part of a group of academics who actually are embedding cultural knowledge into their education resources and really taking that on board. So there are lots of good people that are doing that work and are acknowledging that. And I suppose it's finding those allies and building that relationship up with those allies. So when I say building, just not only your personal relationship, but your network of relationships, building them up with those allies so that we can be stronger and more confident to actually start challenging those. And it's difficult. And I've been in difficult places where I've had my hand up like for 20 minutes and being the only person of color and being totally ignored, you know, with people of power. Just because they don't want to hear what I've got to say, because it's going to challenge them in some way or form. It's going to it's going to question their power. It's going to question their authority. It's going to question what they've actually stated, or it's not included something. So yeah, it's very difficult. So we do need to build that ally.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, I mean, you know, that sort of role of institutions and who's at the table. I mean, I think, I mean, it is an era of misinformation. I think, you know, that there is sort of sometimes a sense somehow, you know, that within universities still, that sort of talking about justice issues, you know, can in many contexts can be seen in a really positive way, but I think, you know, sometimes as well in other contexts can really be seen as, well, not something sometimes that institutions want to deal with, because it's because I think, you know, always when you work, you know, with people and different narratives, and, you know, I think that's somehow messier. It's messier than, okay, so we've got data and we've got, you know, here's what we've got. This is the results that we're looking for. So I mean, I think misinformation. I mean, I think one thing that we haven't mentioned as well, I mean, we haven't mentioned, you know, the role of the media in this as a big institution as well, you know, and clearly social media is really, you know, important and significant for, you know, for getting, you know, often, you know, sort of, you know, different narratives across, but there's also negative narratives within that. And I think just the overall media as well, and the way in which, I mean, we've seen, you know, even over the last sort of couple of weeks, how, you know, newspapers, you know, change the narrative, you know, even of, you know, from, I mean, just thinking about, you know, Afghanistan, that, you know, you could just very sort of subtly see the way that those media narratives change towards, you know, yet again, this, you know, a more sort of right-wing narrative, and you know, borders and, you know, and boundaries, and, you know, and you know, just a very negative approach. I think just thinking about that role of the media, and just the ways in which, you know, the values around, you know, the issues that we're talking, you know, continue just to be reinforced by media narratives is really important as well.
It's also being shut down. So when I say shut down, it's like when you question like authority, or you question like anybody in a position of a knowledge giver, and sometimes you get shut down.
Yeah.
And that's really a difficult place to be in, because how do you come back from that, being shut down?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's, yeah, and I'd be really interested to hear if anybody else has experienced that shut down, you know, where they're trying to find knowledge, but the doors get slammed in their face. And what happens at that point? You know, how did you react? How did you feel? What did you do? Because that's really important, because that's a learning point. So it's like, say, well, and sometimes those doors can be shut or could be slammed just because the person you're asking from actually doesn't know themselves. Mm-hmm. And I've experienced that a lot, especially from religious leaders, when I question things about religion, and it's just like, okay, you just don't know. They just say to me, you don't know, you don't understand, and that's it. So I never move forward, just because. And it's hard for me to move forward and challenge it, because the doors get shut, the pathways get shut. And all I want to do is learn. And I'm saying, you know, all I want to do is learn a bit more. Just tell me your opinion or your views, but they just shut down. It'd be really interesting to see if anybody else has had any experiences similar to that.
Yeah, we already have a comment here saying, "Old white men shut down everyone, gender, race." Sure. If we only have a few minutes left, but do please put in your comments. I'll try and read them out. I just want to touch on COP26 before we end, because I think that was an important thing to acknowledge. Neil, I'm not going to read out the whole question, but you're asking an interesting point about in these formal negotiation in the UNFCCC spaces. So COP26 is happening, the big international climate conference happening in Glasgow this November, hosted by the UK. It is the elite of the elite will be there in the most formal policy discussions. Zarina, you mentioned some of the things you'll be doing there. So I wonder if for both of you, if you're planning on engaging with COP26, and also kind of to draw out Neil's question there, climate justice being quite low down on the priority list of these policy negotiations, because again, it's very much important issues of carbon reductions and whatnot, but these issues of justice aren't really acknowledged about. So I wonder, I'm essentially asking 5 different questions in trying to roll it into one, just because of time. I knew this would happen.
Right, I don't mind going first then. Yeah, it's very difficult to get, so I don't know if anybody knows, but let's say the blue zone, the green zone, and then there's the fringe festivals, right? So the blue zone is where all the negotiations happen. So that's where all the representations from the global leaders come in, right? And that is the focus of like the carbon reduction, and trying to get down to like 1.5 degrees. Now, a lot of those decisions are made well in advance, and they're made by think tanks and policymakers. So people like me, there is no space for people like me, right? So I wouldn't be in that space at all. Would I want to be in that space? I don't know. Sometimes I think, it'd be really good not to be a policy maker, but actually somebody trying to push them to make the change. But I suppose you have to do that before they get there. So you have to do all that. You've got to build that momentum in so that you're putting pressure on the policymakers to be more ambitious before they get to that table. And so that's that part. And then there's the green zone, which is, again, it's very much about the delegates that are coming, and it's about showcasing what's happening. Now, a lot of this is sponsored, right? And it's sponsored by the big corporations. The big corporations have got an investment in all this. So they actually kind of set the agenda. So when I talk about big corporations, I'm talking about the big oil corporations as well, the big power corporations, the energy industry, they are behind all this. And they'll sell it in terms of renewable energy, and they'll sell it in, they'll use the right language to sell why they're there. So activists then tend to be on the fringe. They tend to be on the fringe festival. So I am involved in quite a lot of the fringe festivals, and that's probably not to influence the policymakers, because that's already been done. That's done and dusted. But it's probably about raising awareness, and just to show and highlight that more and more people, it's becoming normalized. Climate change, climate crisis, climate justice, these are conversations that we all need to be having, and to try to normalize those conversations. So that's probably my take on it. So I'll pass it over to Ali.
Yeah, I mean, we're involved in a number of events too. I mean, I just think, flagging up, I don't know if you saw the Guardian article as well today about how COP26 might be the most, sort of exclusionary, COP meeting because of the lack of, affordable accommodation. And actually, we've been talking ourselves about the call that the Climate Action Network has made to basically, call for postponing COP26, because actually I think, for all sorts of reasons, whether it's pandemic related, the travel challenges, unaffordable accommodation, vaccine inequity, it's all actually being set up at this moment as even more inequitable in terms of getting different voices into that city for COP26 compared to other COPs even.
I feel we could keep talking about this for another hour. I really like it, but I'm noting the time, but it's 6 o'clock. Does anyone want to say anything before I wrap up? For just ending it so informally. I feel there's so many different strands I want to draw out, but I know I'll just keep talking for as long as you'll let me. Well, no, that's great. It is 6. I just want to say thank you both so much for attending. This was a really, I knew it would be a very interesting and stimulating conversation. I really did, and it really has. If people want to get in touch with the library, we still have our social medias and whatnot. Please, thank you so much on behalf of the library. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Do keep an eye out on the events page for upcoming events. Thank you, Zarina. Thank you, Ali, for joining us. I really do appreciate the time, and everyone in attendance. Thank you so much for attending. Please do come again, and do stay safe. I really do appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for creating this space for this dialogue. It was really interesting. So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for asking. Yeah.